Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Grant Isaac, President and COO of Cameco. Saskatchewan is in the process of choosing a design for large-scale 1,000 megawatt nuclear reactors. In 2023, Cameco bought 49% of Westinghouse. Westinghouse AP1000 is one of the leading contenders under consideration for large-scale nuclear power generation plants in Saskatchewan. Most significantly, it's a current design with worldwide orders. Hello, folks. Brian Zinchuk of Pipeline Online, and I've got Bronwyn Eyre and Dr. Grant Isaac, President of Cameco and COO. Apologize for the delay. Just when you're talking to the president of a $68 billion company, that's when the tech decides not to work. So, Grant, you've been on the stage a lot here with Tim Gitzel as well, who's your CEO. The two of you basically co-run the company. Can you explain, first of all, who you are, what Cameco is, and what do you have to do with Saskatchewan buying reactors?
Nice to be here, and sorry about the technical delays, and we'll take full responsibility for that. That seemed to be on our end here. So who we are, I don't know. World's largest uranium exploration company, world's largest uranium mining company in terms of size of mines, world's largest uranium refiner, Western world's largest converter of uranium. And of course, now that we own a Westinghouse along with Brookfield, something around 65% of all the reactors in the Western world have fabricated fuel that comes from either our facilities or from Westinghouse's facilities. So pretty central to the nuclear revival globally.
So it's my understanding that Saskatchewan just a few weeks ago, in end of January, announced they're looking at buying large 1,000 megawatt scale reactors. And there's basically three in the Western world on the market. There is the Westinghouse AP1000, the CANDU Monarch, which has not yet been built anywhere, as well as the French EPR. So can you tell us why Saskatchewan should consider the Westinghouse AP1000?
Yeah, I might actually refine your list slightly, Brian. When you look at what's available to build in the gigawatt space, you're right to point out that the French have an EPR reactor, which is being built at Hinkley Point, will be built at Sizewell C. One was built in Finland, one in France, and of course, several in China. But they're downsizing it to an EPR 1200. So that's a design project. That's not a product that exists yet. Don't forget the Koreans. The Koreans have the APR 1400, which was built in the United Arab Emirates. What's interesting about the Koreans is that every Korean reactor is now built under license with Westinghouse because it uses embedded Westinghouse technology. And so we're a part of every reactor program that the Koreans are involved in. And then, of course, you have the AP1000, which is the Westinghouse product, and the CANDU reactor. And obviously, we love CANDUs. We're fully integrated in CANDU reactors.
So you were saying there about the CANDU,
yeah,
and that you provide fuel for them and whatnot.
Yeah, sure we do. So that's an offering we're of course super supportive of. And when there is a Gen 3 CANDU designed and ready to go, we're there and prepared to support it. But your question was about the AP1000 and its role in Canada. And I would just remind you and everybody listening that, well, commercially and technically, the AP1000 is already in Canada. I mean, commercially, it's owned by Canadians, Cameco and Brookfield, which means the strategic management of AP1000s is Canadian already. And of course, Westinghouse's entire global business, as it's successful, those profits flow back to Canada. Half those profits come to Saskatchewan to be reinvested in our mines, in our mills, and building out our future capacity. And technically, Westinghouse Canada has a big engineering shop in Kitchener, Ontario, which has long been involved in the global deployment of AP1000. So the IP, the technology, the familiarity, the technical expertise, it's already in Canada. So this is a very viable option, and it's the only Gen 3 plus reactor available in the large scale that is designed, fuel ready, license ready, regulatory ready, and therefore deployment ready. So we're very excited about the role it can play, not just in Canada, but also building out Canadian supply chain for global opportunities for what seems to be the dominant chosen reactor.
So I want to get into maybe step back just a little bit, because you and I can talk inside baseball quite a bit because we're familiar with it. But what precisely is an AP1000? It's my understanding is it's a pressurized water reactor designed by Westinghouse. It produces about 1,100 megawatts, give or take. I've seen 1,200. I've seen 1,100. If you can clarify that. Two of them went online in 23 and 24 at Vogel, and there are how many under construction right now?
Yeah. So I'm going to take one more step back because that was a good reminder. We can quickly get into acronyms and quickly get into a lot of detail in this industry. Of the global reactor base, 92% of the global fleet are light water reactors. So they're in the category of light water reactors versus the remaining 8% that are pressurized heavy water reactors, like the CANDU reactor and the Indian version of the CANDU reactor. So 92% are light water reactors. And actually that proportion is growing. Of the 68 reactors that are under construction around the world right now as we speak, 66 of 68 are light water reactors. So we have a reactor technology in light water reactors, whether they're boiling water or pressurized water reactors, that really the global markets have spoken. That is the technology that they want. And we can go into a lot of detail on why that has historically been the chosen technology, but it's pretty clear. If Canada wants a techno export strategy that appeals to 100% of the global market, it can't just be in pressurized heavy water reactors, because that's 8% and shrinking. It has to be in light water reactor technology, because that's 92% and growing. So that's kind of the backdrop for the global context. And within that, the AP1000 is the newest version of the light water reactors. It's a pressurized water reactor, not a boiling water reactor. It's a Gen 3 plus. It's the only Gen 3 plus. The 2 that are running in Vogel, plus the 4 that are running in China, plus the 10 under construction in China, mean that it actually is design ready and deployment ready. And we know how to build them, and they've been built. And more importantly, empirically, we can say these are the best performing reactors on the planet with respect to both availability and capacity factors. So the global industry has spoken, and it's no surprise that there is so much interest in this reactor because it is designed, it is deployed. You can go see them operating in Georgia. You can go see them operating in China if you want. And there is a supply chain that's already established and already built. And it's a very simple reactor. You know, if you compare it to its French counterpart or even its Korean counterpart, you know, a third less concrete, a third less steel than those comparable reactors, a heck of a lot of less cabling that goes into it, passive gravity driven safety systems. It is the best in class Western reactor.
Okay, I was going to ask you about India, Grant, and just, you know, the $2.6 billion supply deal, obviously, we've seen in recent weeks between Cameco and that country. So wanted you to tell us a bit about that. I know you'll supply 11,000 tons of reactor fuel from 2027 to 2035. I guess two quick things. I mean, what are the tangible benefits of such a deal to the people of Saskatchewan, royalties wise, otherwise, just so people can get a concept, I guess, of how this benefits them, so to speak. And I guess the other thing I wouldn't mind you commenting on is we've seen, you know, the Trump administration sort of descend onto Cameco, as it were, and you know, you doing this kind of, well, one-off deal in a certain way, sort of state to company, similarly state to company, India to Cameco. How are we to think of that? Is it almost bypassing, you know, the federal government, the provincial government, and becoming sort of more of a one-off arrangement? How are we to think of those two things, and the India deal specifically?
Yeah, and let me unpack both of those, and let's just draw a thread between Brian's opening question and this. India has an interest in nuclear power for the reasons that a lot of others do. It offers climate security, energy security, national security. The attributes of nuclear are being recognized, and therefore that's what's driving the revival in new builds. And India is no different. Of course, India for many years focused on its own domestic technology, then started building light water reactors that were Russian, then wanted to pivot to Western reactors, both the French reactor as well as Westinghouse. They've chosen Westinghouse AP1000s for a 6-reactor site. And if you're going to have those kind of big ambitions, you better have the fuel, and no better company to turn to than Cameco, no better jurisdiction than Saskatchewan to turn to. And certainly that's a legacy of yours, Minister, when you were the energy minister, helped set up that wonderful framework that we have for a terrific mining jurisdiction that is Saskatchewan. So in our industry, it's very common for us to be dealing with states. We don't have a single transaction that doesn't have state-to-state involvement in some degree or form. We have exporter to importer licenses, but they always carry a party of export, party of import overlay. So many of our customers are state buyers, and India isn't an exception there. So they turn to us. They're looking for that reliable, secure fuel for a big appetite to build out nuclear, and that's going to include the AP1000 reactor. And let's think of that as Saskatchewan owned. The Saskatchewan owned reactor is going to be fueled by Saskatchewan uranium over a very long period of time. What a great partnership, and what a great way to build on all of the other things Saskatchewan and India could certainly be doing together. If I pivot to the US, I think you're referring to the deal we have with the US government. So that's a Cameco, Brookfield, Westinghouse deal for the US government to really launch new build in the United States. $80 billion minimum spend in order to build 10 reactors. It really came from a recognition in the US that the way their market was set up, it wasn't incenting launch conditions. Canada's building small modular reactors in Ontario. Poland's building, Bulgaria's building, the Czech Republic, Czechia is building. And yet the United States couldn't find launch conditions to build nuclear. And the issue there was concerns among the utilities about standing up the supply chain and utilities taking on that risk. And the US government just finally said, look, we'll do that. If what's required is we have to put in a big order and get this whole thing going, then that's what we're prepared to do. So since that announcement, we've been working on what does a big order for 10 reactors look like? What does it mean for Westinghouse? Where are those reactors going to get built? Under what model are they going to get built? And then the financing, is it going to come from Japanese foreign direct investment pledges, or South Korean or Emirati, or is it going to come from Department of Energy loan program funding, now called Energy Dominance Financing Office? We're just not sure yet, but the willingness to build out reactors for their own energy security, as well as part of energy diplomacy globally, has finally been crystallized in the United States. And by the way, that's great for every jurisdiction that is thinking about building AP1000s, because you've got the world's biggest economy helping de-risk the drive from next of a kind to nth of a kind. That's going to benefit everybody that wants to install the technology. And what are we talking about? We're talking about building 100-year energy cathedrals. That's what an AP1000 is.
So you actually touched on a few things there that regarding the what we call it, large purchases. In Canada, we have Bruce is looking at 4 reactors at Bruce C. OPG is looking at it looks like 8 at Wesleyville, which you can see from your Port Hope facility.
Yes, we can.
Just down the road from it. Saskatchewan's looking at possibly 2, and Energy Alberta is looking at possibly 4. So we're looking at something like 18 reactors. And there's a lot of talk about a fleet buy. Saskatchewan's not going to go on its own and choose CANDU if everyone else is building Westinghouse. for the CANDU folks, if they can't sell reactors to Canadians, I don't know how well they're going to do elsewhere. They did have an announcement about Turkey yesterday, but I mean, for you folks here, how important is it that if OPG buys 8 reactors of your type, what impact does that have on Saskatchewan regarding supply chains, cost? You know, the fact that we're not going off one alone and spending enormous amounts on something that's, you know, newly developed.
The trick to successfully building the next fleet of reactors, it's not a mystery. We have to standardize, we have to sequence, and we have to simplify. If you think about the build out through the 60s and 70s in the United States, peaked at 104 reactors, 55 different models. Can't do that again. That's not going to work this time. So as long as enough jurisdictions are saying, you know, we at the outset, we have to manage risk. And what does that look like? If Brian, you were running a utility considering new build, you actually have 5 big risks to manage. That's what you're going to go to your shareholders, whether you're a Crown Corporation or privately held like Bruce Power, you're going to go to your shareholders and you ultimately have to manage 5 risks. The first is design risk. Second is fuel risk. Third is licensing risk. Fourth is regulatory risk. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. And fifth is just good old fashioned big project risk, right? With design risk, you do not want to put to your shareholders first of a kind. That is something that people shy away from in nuclear for good reason. The nuclear industry has not done first of a kind very well. So you're going to look for a reactor that is design ready, not one that still needs taxpayer dollars to be designed, one that, you know, isn't quite finished, but one where you can actually go see one of those things operating. So in our business, it's all about standardizing the design to Vogtle 4. Fuel.
John Gorman told me that basically anyone who wants to build these, and he's president of Westinghouse Canada, anyone who wants to build them, you can have make color you want as long as it's black. We're not changing the damn thing.
Yeah, you know, I've heard it put another way. It's Vogtle 4 over and over again, right down to the color of the paint in the bathroom. Like nothing changes. So we have to standardize. Good news is we've already dealt with that risk for you. We have a standard design for the AP1000. So your second risk is fuel. Most people don't realize many of the advanced nuclear reactor designs that folks are talking about, high temperature gas reactors, molten salt reactors. I couldn't tell you today what the commercial fuel cycle looks like for that. And we build a heck of a lot of fuel between Cameco and Westinghouse. I don't know the cost of triso fuel. You know, I don't know the cost of metal fuel for a molten salt reactor. And that would be like buying a really big fleet of electric vehicles and having no place to plug them in. You just wouldn't take that risk. No problem. We've got that risk solved. We know how to build the fuel for AP1000s. There's no commercial risk. Licensing something for the first time is often a very, very big risk in the nuclear industry. Well, we've got a license in the US, we've got a license in the UK, which are 2 of the big 3 regulators, and reciprocal agreements with Canada to finish the license process here. So that isn't a risk for AP1000s. And then regulatory, distinct from licensing. You've got a design, you've got a commercial fuel supply, you have a license, but you're going to put it someplace where it's never been put before. So there will be first of a kind regulations. Well, we have a design basis for the regulations now. You can just look at a new jurisdiction and you can say, how does it compare to the Vogtle site in Georgia, seismologically, hydrologically, and make your adjustments from a regulatory base that already exists. So in other words, the AP1000 takes 4 of 5 risks off the table for you on day one when you're making the decision about nuclear new build. And now you're just left with managing a big project. And when you look at the history of nuclear and the things that have gone off the rails, it's been because we didn't manage the first 4 risks. It's not that the project people were terrible. It's just the design wasn't done. And then that created a negative loop with licensing, and it created a negative loop with regulatory, and it created time delays. And usually the biggest cost is just having a bunch of people mobilized with nothing to do. So we have a product that takes 4 of 5 of those risks off the table. So You then look at a decision that a utility might make, and then they're going to ask, are others sharing in the cost of doing this? So that's where the fleet model comes from. So as long as we're standardizing, as long as we're sequencing and not trying to do everything at the same time on the same day, and then simplifying. And by simplifying, I don't mean go back and change the design. By simplifying, I mean make sure we commit to teaching each other what worked. Then we will have the positive experience that the Emiratis did building the Korean reactors, or quite frankly, the enormous success the Chinese are having building our reactor domestically in China. Standardize, sequence, and simplify. As long as those principles are there, that fleet model works and works very well, helps us get from next of a kind to nth of a kind, which, by the way, is where those who are paying for electricity want us to be.
Just got to go to ad for 30 seconds. Be right back. For your well servicing needs in southeast Saskatchewan and southwest Manitoba, you need the General. That's General Well Servicing of Cardiff, Saskatchewan. They've got a fleet of double, triple rigs, pressure vessels, and lighting rentals ready to serve you. They can perform rig assist and frac assist operations as well. Call Kevin at 306-482-3244. That's Call the General at 306-482-3244. Yes, sir. So, folks, we only got about 10 minutes left. Bronwyn, we're going to get you up next.
Okay, just on the fleet model, I guess, Grant, and you referenced Georgia, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on any of these components here, but the AP1000 Georgia, and I believe was quite over budget, and I take your point that one learns as one goes along, but anyway, that also China. I guess one of the concerns about the AP1000 that I can sort of see in the tea leaves out there on the Westinghouse model versus the CANDU model is the IP security, the tech security. Some concerns have been raised about, CANDU being completely Canadian, the AP model being, at least bound up in some other jurisdictions, US, China, otherwise. So just wanted you to comment on that and correct any of those misperceptions if you could. And I guess just while we're at it and given the time, the refinement issue, because that's also come up vis-a-vis CANDU versus Westinghouse. So we have that public perception possible issue around the refinement. And I guess if you could just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me start with the IP piece. At the outset, I mentioned that the AP1000 should be thought of as Canada's reactor, and it should also be thought of as Cameco's reactor, which therefore should be thought of as Saskatchewan's reactor. Why? Because we own it, and we control its deployment, and the profits that come from its deployment in Canada, as well as in other jurisdictions, flow back here. This is very much a Canadian project, and I also said that technically it should be thought of as a Canadian reactor because the protocols to allow the IP to flow back and forth across the border have been in place since 2018 because Westinghouse Canada works on the deployment of AP1000s globally. So the reactor is already here, technically speaking. There is no barrier to using the technology and deploying it in Canada. We would go extra steps in today's geopolitical environment in order to deal with concerns that sometimes get raised in the defense industry about, you hear about how if you buy military equipment from the US, they retain a kill switch and they can shut off that can't happen with an AP1000. There's no kill switch in an AP1000. But Cameco or Westinghouse Canada will hold all of the IP to build, operate, and decommission an AP1000 in Canada on Canadian servers, on Canadian soil, in a Canadian corporate structure that actually is beyond the reach of the U.S. government. So that fear has been fomented. It's completely inaccurate. So thank you for raising it and giving me an opportunity to dispel it because it's actually a bit ridiculous. So there are no barriers to deploying the technology in Canada, and it can't be revoked by anybody. You asked about Georgia, the Vogtle experience. And this is really important because it goes to the 4 or 5 risks that you have to manage up front. The problem with the new build at Georgia was exactly the design risk. Westinghouse began to build the reactor before it was designed. That is lesson number one. Don't do that. Don't build a reactor for which you don't have the design locked down. So what's the lesson now? Well, don't build an AP1000 unless you have the design. We happen to have the design. You look ahead, why build something that isn't designed, or that taxpayers need to have to step forward and fund the completion of the design on? So we've already removed the biggest barrier. But I would step back and just remind everybody that oftentimes we lose sight of the overall value that comes from nuclear, right? So first of all, when you build a nuclear plant, it has the same multiplier effect that any big project does, essentially 2 times the value of the project. So when people go, yeah, Vogtle was a complete disaster, it was supposed to be 12 billion, it ended up being 30. Well, that also means the economic multiplier in the state of Georgia wasn't $24 billion. It was $60 billion. That was $60 billion spent in the state of Georgia. That's a heck of an economic multiplier, which created massive benefits for the state of Georgia. Secondly, there is a cluster multiplier. As soon as you put in 80 to 100 year power infrastructure, 24-hour baseload, guess what it immediately attracts? Industry. It attracts manufacturing industry. It will attract data industry. It will attract advanced manufacturing. It'll create onshoring opportunities. And then those go on to create a multiplier of their own. And then, of course, in the case of Saskatchewan, quite uniquely, Cameco is building 80 to 100 years of its own core demand. Every reactor program that we're a part of, whether it's via Westinghouse or via the Koreans, we're sitting at the table reminding people there are long lead items: reactor pressure vessels, reactor coolant pumps, instrumentation and control module, and fuel. And fuel is a lot longer lead item for a lot more decades than all of those other things. So when you add it all up, the opportunity that is created for this province by deploying AP1000s in Canada and beyond is quite frankly enormous. I'm going to go back to your US example. 10 reactors in the US fueled for the first 10 years is 65 million pounds of uranium demand. I happen to like that in the core of the Cameco business.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry about that. I know we have to go in about 2 minutes here, Grant, so I got to ask the big question. Premier Moe calls you up, calls Tim up and says, I want 2 of these things. What's the total cost?
Depends where you fit in the standardized to sequence. So Vogtle 3 was 18 billion. Vogtle 4 was 12. Very, very significant learning effects just between 2 units. If you play it out on industrial learning models, that nth of a kind AP1000 should be about $5 billion. So the next one is going to be less than 12. It's going to be more than 5. The next one after that is going to keep coming down that curve. So if we wait for nth of a kind, we can have very, very affordable AP1000 installations. We're no first of a kind risk. We're benefiting from a supply chain that's already in flight. But if we wait for nth of a kind, we're going to lose some first mover advantages on the supply chain. So we have to think very carefully as a jurisdiction, where do we want to be? Do we want to be well nth of a kind on just power production? Or do we want to be closer to the front of the pack because we don't just want power production domestically? We want to be part of the global supply chain for the 92% of the markets that want light water reactor technology. That's the decision for the province of Saskatchewan.
So should we punt on SMRs and just go straight to big ones?
We're seeing in jurisdiction after jurisdiction that what started as a conversation around small, I think we're going to look back and we're going to say small modular reactors were this incredible Trojan horse. They got nuclear back in the conversation when people didn't want to talk about big reactors. But now that they're talking nuclear and they're realizing that nuclear is not different than a lot of power sources, it's megawatts per square foot that really matters. And so the more megawatts you can get out of one production facility, the better the economics. All those conversations are going back up to big. It does not surprise me that Alberta, Saskatchewan are now starting to talk big. There's a reason why every place else is building large modular reactors, because size matters in nuclear.
I understand you're short for time now, so thank you very much, Grant. We'd love to have you on again in the future. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more, and I'd like to get Westinghouse on soon.
Yeah, happy to do it. Really appreciate your time. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
It's lovely to
very
have
much,
you,
folks.
Grant.